Nietzsche introduces eternal recurrence at this exact point because everything that came before has reached its limit. Nihilism has exposed the collapse of inherited values. Will to power has explained how values arise once no authority stands above life. What remains unresolved is a final question, not theoretical but existential. Can life be affirmed without remainder? Eternal recurrence is Nietzsche's answer to that question, but not in the form of a doctrine or belief. It is introduced here because it functions as a test, and tests only make sense after diagnosis. One cannot test affirmation before denial has been dismantled. Up to this point, Nietzsche has shown how people explain life, justify life, and interpret life. Eternal recurrence asks something far more demanding: whether one could will life exactly as it is, without appeal to progress, redemption, or escape. This is why the concept does not appear earlier. Before nihilism, people believed life would be redeemed later, by God, by truth, by moral progress. Before will to power, people believed values were given rather than created. Eternal recurrence would have been unintelligible under those assumptions. Here, however, those illusions are gone. Eternal recurrence is introduced only once the possibility of external justification has collapsed. It asks whether life can be affirmed without conditions, not because it leads somewhere better, not because it improves, but because it is what it is. Nietzsche does not introduce eternal recurrence to explain the universe. He introduces it to confront the individual with the full weight of existence. If nothing redeems life from outside, then affirmation must occur within life itself, or not at all. This is why eternal recurrence follows will to power rather than preceding it. Will to power explains how values are created. Eternal recurrence tests whether those values are strong enough to withstand the most severe demand imaginable. Repetition without end. The placement matters. Eternal recurrence is not an abstract speculation added for drama. It is the culmination of Nietzsche's confrontation with nihilism. It forces the question that critique alone cannot answer: whether affirmation is merely conceptual, or whether it reaches all the way down into one's relation to time, suffering, and necessity. Nietzsche introduces this idea here because only now can it do its work. Earlier, it would have been deflected by hope. Now it cannot be escaped. This is not a theory to be accepted or rejected. It is a mirror held up to one's life. And Nietzsche places it here because, after everything that has been dismantled, there is nowhere left to hide. Nietzsche is acutely aware that eternal recurrence invites immediate misinterpretation, and before the idea can function as he intends, these misunderstandings must be blocked. Eternal recurrence is not a doctrine about the structure of the universe, nor is it a promise about rebirth or cosmic repetition. To read it this way is to miss its function entirely. First, eternal recurrence is not reincarnation. Nietzsche is not suggesting that a soul returns in another life, nor that one lives again with altered circumstances. There is no continuity of consciousness across cycles, no opportunity for correction, improvement, or escape. Everything returns exactly as it was, down to the smallest detail. Second, it is not a cosmological theory. Nietzsche does not ask us to believe that the universe literally repeats itself according to physical laws. Although he occasionally speculates about this possibility, proof is beside the point. If eternal recurrence depended on being scientifically true, it would lose its force. Belief would replace confrontation. Third, eternal recurrence is not a comforting metaphysical idea. There is no promise of justice, balance, or ultimate meaning. Nothing is redeemed by repetition. Suffering does not become worthwhile because it happens again. Repetition intensifies the weight of existence rather than softening it. Nietzsche strips away these interpretations because they all provide escape routes. Reincarnation offers hope of improvement. Cosmology offers intellectual distance. Metaphysics offers consolation. Eternal recurrence allows none of these. What Nietzsche is constructing instead is a thought experiment designed to bypass belief entirely. It does not ask whether recurrence is true. It asks whether one could endure it, whether one could affirm life under the most severe imaginable condition. By rejecting metaphysical readings, Nietzsche ensures that eternal recurrence remains existential rather than speculative. It is not something one debates, it is something one confronts. The question is not, does this happen, but what would it mean for you if it did? This is why Nietzsche never systematizes eternal recurrence. Any attempt to turn it into doctrine neutralizes its force. It becomes an idea among others, rather than a demand placed on one's relation to life. Eternal recurrence is therefore not about the universe. It is about you, your life, and your capacity to say yes to it without appeal to future redemption or metaphysical escape. By clearing away these misreadings, Nietzsche prepares the thought experiment to do what it is meant to do, force a confrontation with existence without illusion. Nietzsche presents eternal recurrence in the form of a thought experiment, not an argument. He asks us to imagine a scenario designed to bypass abstraction and strike directly at our relation to life. A demon appears and tells you that this life, every joy, every pain, every failure, every boredom, every fleeting moment, will return again and again in the exact same sequence for all eternity. Nothing will be different. Nothing can be corrected. Nothing can be improved. Every sigh, every hesitation, every regret must be lived again endlessly. Nietzsche's point is not the demon. The demon is a device. What matters is the reaction it provokes. Would this announcement crush you? Would it feel like the heaviest possible burden, or would it be received as something else entirely? The thought experiment is total. Eternal recurrence does not allow selective affirmation. One cannot say yes to the beautiful moments and no to the painful ones. The repetition includes everything, even the smallest, most forgettable details. This totality is essential. Partial affirmation is still denial. This is why Nietzsche frames the question so starkly. If you recoil at the idea of recurrence, it reveals something about your relation to life as it is actually lived. It exposes regret, resentment, or the quiet hope that things might one day be redeemed, corrected, or made worthwhile later. The experiment strips away future-oriented meaning. There is no progress towards something better. There is no final justification waiting ahead. There is only this life, repeated without end. Nietzsche is not asking whether one wants recurrence. Desire is beside the point. He is asking whether one could will it, whether one could affirm life so completely that even its repetition would be embraced rather than resisted. This is why eternal recurrence functions as a test rather than a belief. It does not tell you how to live. It reveals how you already relate to existence. Your reaction is the answer. The clarity of the thought experiment lies in its cruelty. There is no escape clause, no metaphysical comfort, no moral compensation. What remains is the bare structure of one's affirmation or denial of life. Nietzsche places this test at the center of his philosophy because nothing else exposes the difference between superficial acceptance and unconditional affirmation so starkly. Eternal recurrence is therefore not about the future, it is about the present, whether one can say yes to life as it is, without reservation, explanation, or hope of escape. Nietzsche understands that eternal recurrence is not merely difficult to accept. It is intimidating in a way few ideas are. Its terror does not come from physical pain or metaphysical mystery, but from what it exposes about one's relationship to life. Most people live with an unspoken assumption that what is painful, regrettable, or disappointing will somehow be redeemed later. The future is treated as a corrective. Mistakes will be compensated for. Suffering will eventually make sense. Life denial often hides inside this quiet hope. Eternal recurrence destroys that hope completely. There is no later in which things turn out better. There is no final balance in which losses are repaid. Every moment returns exactly as it was, including the moments one would most like to erase. This is why the thought is terrifying. It confronts regret head-on. Regret is not simply the memory of error, it is the wish that one's life had been otherwise. Eternal recurrence removes the possibility of otherwise. What has been done is what will always be done. Resentment is exposed just as harshly. Resentment depends on comparison, on the sense that one was denied something one deserved, or that life dealt unfairly. Recurrence offers no court of appeal. Life is not judged, it is repeated. The terror also comes from boredom. Nietzsche is attentive here. It is not only trauma that weighs heavily under recurrence, but monotony. The small, dull moments, waiting, routine, trivial irritation, return endlessly. The thought experiment forces confrontation with the texture of everyday life, not just its dramatic highs and lows. For many, this reveals a deeper discomfort, the sense that life is being endured rather than lived. If existence is something one tolerates while waiting for change, recurrence becomes unbearable. It exposes how much of life is postponed rather than affirmed. Nietzsche sees this terror as diagnostic. It reveals where affirmation fails. The recoil is not a moral failing, it is a symptom. It shows that life is being justified by reference to something outside itself. Progress, redemption, meaning yet to come. Eternal recurrence strips all of that away. What remains is life as it has been lived so far. If that life cannot be willed again, Nietzsche suggests, then it has not truly been affirmed. This is why the idea feels crushing rather than enlightening. It removes consolation, it removes escape, it leaves only the raw question, is this life one could will again without condition? The terror of eternal recurrence is therefore not pathological, it is honest. It arises precisely because the thought touches something fundamental, the degree to which one has reconciled oneself with existence itself. Nietzsche treats eternal recurrence as the ultimate test because it removes every remaining excuse for affirmation. One can affirm life conditionally, if it improves, if it leads somewhere better, if suffering is redeemed, if meaning arrives later. Eternal recurrence eliminates all such conditions. To affirm recurrence is to affirm life without remainder. Nothing is filtered out. Nothing is justified by reference to a future outcome. The question is no longer whether life can be tolerated, improved, or endured, but whether it can be willed exactly as it is. This is why Nietzsche insists that affirmation here is no longer theoretical. One cannot affirm recurrence by agreeing with a proposition. The response is visceral. It reveals itself in recoil or acceptance, not in argument. Affirmation at this level means something precise, the ability to say yes not only to joy and intensity, but to pain, error, boredom, and loss. Not because they serve a purpose, but because they are inseparable from the life one lives. This distinguishes affirmation from optimism. Optimism hopes for improvement. Eternal recurrence forbids hope. It asks whether one could affirm existence even if nothing ever changed. It also distinguishes affirmation from resignation. Resignation accepts life because resistance feels futile. Affirmation wills life again. The difference is subtle but decisive. Resignation endures repetition as burden. Affirmation embraces repetition as necessity. Nietzsche's point is not that one must feel joy at the thought of recurrence. What matters is whether one could will it, whether one's life has been lived in such a way that its repetition would not be rejected outright. This makes eternal recurrence merciless. It measures the depth of one's affirmation without allowing interpretation to soften the demand. There is no narrative, no redemption, no explanation to lean on. For Nietzsche, this is why eternal recurrence separates reactive life from creative life. Reactive life needs the future to justify the present. Creative life draws justification from itself. It does not need life to lead somewhere else. Eternal recurrence therefore exposes the final residue of life denial. Wherever affirmation depends on progress, correction, or escape, recurrence becomes unbearable. Wherever affirmation is unconditional, recurrence loses its terror. This is why Nietzsche treats eternal recurrence not as a belief to be adopted, but as a measure. It reveals whether one's yes to life is provisional or complete. At this point, affirmation can no longer hide behind concepts. It must confront time itself. Nietzsche introduces eternal recurrence in direct opposition to the ideas of hope, progress, and redemption. Not because these ideas are false in every sense, but because they function as psychological escapes from life as it is. Hope places meaning in the future. It tells us that the present is tolerable because something better is coming. Progress promises that history moves toward improvement, that suffering is temporary and justified by eventual outcomes. Redemption assures that errors, guilt, and pain will be balanced or erased later. Eternal recurrence dismantles all three at once. If every moment returns endlessly, then nothing is redeemed later. There is no final state in which suffering is made worthwhile. There is no historical arc bending toward justice. The future no longer compensates for the present, it repeats it. Nietzsche sees these future-oriented meanings as subtle forms of life denial. They tolerate life only on the condition that it is not final. They endure the present by postponing affirmation. Eternal recurrence refuses this postponement. This is why the idea feels so severe. It forces confrontation with the possibility that life must be affirmed without reference to what comes next. Meaning can no longer be deferred. Justification cannot be outsourced to history, heaven, or progress. Nietzsche does not deny that hope and progress have been powerful motivators. They organized entire cultures. But he insists that they also trained people to experience the present as insufficient. Life became something to be passed through rather than inhabited. Under eternal recurrence, this structure collapses. The present is no longer a bridge to something else. It becomes decisive. Every moment carries the full weight of existence because it is not leading anywhere beyond itself. This has a profound psychological effect. Without hope as consolation, one must either reconcile with life or reject it entirely. There is no neutral position. Eternal recurrence removes the middle ground where endurance disguises itself as affirmation. Nietzsche's challenge here is not to despair, but to revalue time itself. If the future cannot redeem the present, then the present must become worthy on its own terms, or not at all. This is why eternal recurrence is incompatible with salvation narratives of any kind. Salvation always presupposes escape from what is. Recurrence insists on staying. Nietzsche is not asking whether progress exists in some empirical sense. He is asking whether one's affirmation of life depends on progress. If it does, recurrence exposes that dependence mercilessly. By opposing hope, progress, and redemption, eternal recurrence brings affirmation into the present tense. Life is no longer justified by where it is going. It must be justified where it stands. Nietzsche understands that the most crushing aspect of eternal recurrence is not pain, catastrophe, or tragedy, but repetition itself. What weighs heaviest is not that suffering returns, but that everything returns, especially the ordinary, the trivial, and the dull. Most philosophies focus on dramatic moments. Nietzsche focuses on the texture of daily life. Waiting, routine, irritation, hesitation, boredom. These are the moments most people endure rather than affirm. Eternal recurrence forces confrontation with this endurance. Repetition exposes what one truly values. If life were composed only of peak experiences, recurrence might feel tolerable, but life is mostly composed of the in-between. Eternal recurrence asks whether these moments are merely tolerated on the way to something else, or whether they belong fully to what one affirms. This is where boredom becomes philosophically decisive. Boredom reveals that life is being lived as a means, not as an end. It signals that meaning has been postponed. Under recurrence, boredom is no longer a temporary inconvenience. It becomes eternal. Nietzsche sees this as psychologically devastating because it strips away distraction. One can endure boredom if it is finite. One cannot easily affirm boredom without end. The thought experiment exposes how much of life is being waited through rather than lived. Repetition also intensifies responsibility. Every small choice matters because it will be repeated endlessly. There is no forgetting, no erasure, no dilution through time. The weight of one's habits becomes unbearable if those habits are empty. This is why eternal recurrence cannot be met with indifference. Indifference relies on the assumption that moments pass and dissolve. Recurrence makes every moment permanent. Psychological distance collapses. Nietzsche is not suggesting that one must enjoy repetition. He is exposing the depth of one's engagement with life. Where engagement is shallow, repetition suffocates. Where engagement is deep, repetition becomes bearable. This segment reveals why eternal recurrence is more demanding than nihilism. Nihilism empties meaning. Eternal recurrence tests whether meaning can be sustained under infinite repetition. The psychological weight here is decisive. It reveals whether one's life has density, intensity, and coherence, or whether it is being endured under the quiet hope that something else will eventually justify it. Eternal recurrence does not judge life. It mirrors it back with infinite amplification. Nietzsche is explicit, though often misunderstood on this point. Eternal recurrence is not meant for everyone. It is not a universal demand placed on humanity, nor a moral test that all are expected to pass. It is a selective pressure, a thought that reveals differences in strength rather than erasing them. Eternal recurrence presupposes a certain capacity. To even confront the idea without collapsing into despair requires a degree of integration, a life that is not lived primarily in reaction, resentment, or postponement. Where life is experienced mainly as burden, recurrence is crushing rather than illuminating. This is why Nietzsche never presents eternal recurrence as an ethical obligation. To do so would immediately contradict its function. Obligation reintroduces external authority. Eternal recurrence removes authority altogether and asks for an internal response. Reactive forms of life cannot bear recurrence because they depend on future-oriented justification. They live through hope, compensation, or moral accounting. When those structures are removed, nothing remains to stabilize experience. Recurrence exposes this dependence mercilessly. Nietzsche does not condemn this. He diagnoses it. Most forms of life require consolation in order to persist. Eternal recurrence would not elevate them, it would destroy them. This is precisely why Nietzsche refuses to universalize the thought. The idea functions instead as a threshold. It separates forms of life that require escape from those that can endure necessity. It is not a judgment of worth, but a revelation of capacity. This also explains why Nietzsche treats eternal recurrence as dangerous. In the wrong context, it could produce paralysis or nihilistic despair rather than affirmation. Without sufficient strength, the thought does not liberate, it overwhelms. Nietzsche, therefore, withholds the idea. He presents it obliquely, poetically, even cryptically. It is not proclaimed, it is encountered. Only those already oriented toward affirmation can engage with it productively. Eternal recurrence is thus not a test to be passed, but a mirror that shows what kind of life one is living. For some, it reveals exhaustion. For others, it reveals the possibility of affirmation without appeal. By insisting that eternal recurrence is not for everyone, Nietzsche avoids turning it into dogma. It remains what it was meant to be, a selective challenge, not a universal command. This selectivity prepares the final turn. If eternal recurrence cannot be demanded of all, then the question shifts again, toward the type of life capable of bearing it. Nietzsche does not treat eternal recurrence as a standalone idea. It only becomes intelligible in relation to will to power. Without will to power, recurrence looks like a cruel fantasy. With it, recurrence becomes a test of creative strength. Will to power explains how life creates values. Eternal recurrence tests whether those values are strong enough to endure absolute repetition. The two ideas function together. One explains genesis, the other measures durability. Reactive forms of will to power cannot survive recurrence. Reactive life defines itself through opposition, grievance, and comparison. It needs an enemy, a future correction, or a moral ledger. Under recurrence, these structures collapse. Nothing is corrected, nothing is settled. Reaction loses its footing. Creative will to power, by contrast, does not depend on negation. It affirms itself through expression. It does not need life to be redeemed elsewhere. Because of this, it alone has the potential to withstand recurrence. Nietzsche's point is not that creative life enjoys repetition. It is that creative life can will necessity. It can say yes to what must be, even when that includes pain, failure, and loss. This capacity distinguishes creation from reaction more decisively than any moral criterion. Eternal recurrence, therefore, intensifies will to power. It strips away interpretations that cannot bear necessity and leaves only those capable of affirmation without appeal. Weak interpretations dissolve, strong ones remain. This explains why Nietzsche does not offer recurrence as advice. It is not something one adopts to become stronger. It reveals whether strength already exists. Will to power is expressed in how one responds, not in whether one agrees. Recurrence also exposes the difference between power as domination and power as creation. Domination seeks control over outcomes. Recurrence removes control. What remains is the power to affirm without controlling. In this way, eternal recurrence forces will to power inward. It is no longer about shaping the world to one's advantage. It is about affirming existence, even when advantage disappears. Nietzsche uses this pairing to close off escape routes. If one tries to interpret will to power as mere assertion or conquest, recurrence blocks it. If one tries to interpret recurrence as resignation, will to power blocks that as well. Together, these ideas demand a form of strength that does not rely on hope, resentment, or moral compensation. They demand a yes that does not negotiate. This is why eternal recurrence is not an addition to will to power, but its most severe consequence. It reveals whether creative force is deep enough to affirm life in its entirety, not once, but forever. Nietzsche regarded eternal recurrence as his most demanding idea, not because it is conceptually complex, but because it allows no evasion. Other ideas can be debated, reinterpreted, or softened. Eternal recurrence confronts the individual directly with the totality of their life and asks for an answer that cannot hide behind theory. Nihilism can be analyzed, will to power can be explained. Even the overman can be misunderstood as metaphor. Eternal recurrence resists all of this. It is not something one thinks about safely. It presses on one's life as it has actually been lived. Its difficulty lies in its totality. Most affirmations are partial. People affirm some aspects of life while quietly rejecting others. Eternal recurrence forbids this division. It demands affirmation of every moment, including those one would rather forget, excuse, or reinterpret. This is why Nietzsche calls it the heaviest weight. The weight is not repetition itself, but the demand that nothing be excluded. One cannot appeal to learning, growth, or future compensation. What has happened is what will always happen. Eternal recurrence is also difficult because it removes narrative comfort. Humans live by stories: progress, redemption, improvement, resolution. Recurrence flattens narrative. There is no climax, no final lesson, no conclusion. Life becomes circular rather than directional. This exposes how deeply people rely on endings to make sense of beginnings. Without an endpoint, meaning must be carried entirely by the present. For most lives, this demand is unbearable. Nietzsche also knew that eternal recurrence cannot be achieved. There is no training, method, or discipline that guarantees the ability to affirm it. One cannot work toward it as a goal. It arrives as a verdict on how one has lived. This makes it harder than moral commandments, which at least offer rules to follow. Eternal recurrence offers nothing. It simply asks whether one could will one's life again, exactly as it is. The idea is also hard because it is non-transferable. One cannot rely on collective affirmation. No group can will recurrence on one's behalf. The confrontation is solitary. Nietzsche understood that most readers would recoil from this. That recoil is part of the point. Eternal recurrence reveals the gap between conceptual affirmation and existential affirmation, between saying yes in theory and saying yes with one's life. This is why Nietzsche never systematizes the idea or argues for its truth. Proof would miss the point. What matters is not whether recurrence happens, but what one's response to it reveals. Eternal recurrence is Nietzsche's hardest idea because it refuses compromise. It does not negotiate with hope, morality, or consolation. It demands an answer that can only be given by how one lives. Nietzsche does not conclude eternal recurrence with a declaration or a solution. Instead, there is a silence, a pause in which the weight of the thought must be borne. This silence is deliberate. Eternal recurrence is not meant to be resolved intellectually. It prepares the ground for a transformation in how one relates to necessity itself. This is where Amor Fati quietly enters. Eternal recurrence asks whether one could will life again. Amor Fati goes further. It asks whether one could love it, not tolerate it, not endure it, not justify it, but love it as necessary. The transition is subtle. Eternal recurrence exposes whether affirmation is conditional. Amor Fati describes what affirmation looks like once it becomes unconditional. Where recurrence confronts, Amor Fati integrates. Nietzsche does not introduce Amor Fati as a command. It is not a virtue to be cultivated by discipline. It names a posture that becomes possible only after resentment has been exhausted. One cannot love necessity while still wishing that life had been otherwise. This is why eternal recurrence must come first. Recurrence destroys the fantasy that things could have unfolded differently. Amor Fati accepts this destruction and goes further. It affirms necessity itself, not as compensation, but as expression. The love involved here is not sentimental. It is not happiness or contentment. It is a yes that includes pain, failure, and loss without demanding that they be redeemed. It is the refusal to interpret suffering as mistake. Nietzsche understands how rare this posture is. Most people can endure necessity. Few can love it. Endurance still contains resistance. Love does not. This transition also marks a shift in time. Eternal recurrence collapses the future into the present. Amor Fati dissolves the desire to escape the present altogether. One no longer waits for justification. Life no longer needs to go somewhere else to be acceptable. Nietzsche does not spell this out as a doctrine because doctrines invite imitation. Amor Fati cannot be imitated. It emerges only where resentment no longer governs interpretation. The silence at the end of eternal recurrence is therefore not absence. It is preparation. Something new is possible, but it cannot be forced. It must arise organically from the way one has confronted life's necessity. This quiet transition explains why Nietzsche's final affirmations are so restrained. After eternal recurrence, shouting would be vulgar. Only a deepening of affirmation remains possible. Eternal recurrence tests. Amor Fati answers, not in words, but in how one lives with what cannot be changed. Nietzsche never attempts to prove eternal recurrence, and this is not an oversight or a weakness. It is essential to the role the idea plays in his philosophy. A proof would neutralize the thought by turning it into a belief, and belief is precisely what eternal recurrence is designed to bypass. If eternal recurrence were established as a scientific or metaphysical fact, the individual's response would no longer matter in the way Nietzsche intends. Acceptance or rejection would become a matter of assent to evidence rather than a confrontation with one's life. The test would collapse into doctrine. Nietzsche is explicit that what matters is not whether recurrence is true, but what one's reaction to it reveals. Proof would shift attention away from life and toward theory. It would allow distance, debate, and intellectual evasion. By refusing proof, Nietzsche ensures that eternal recurrence remains existential rather than theoretical. The thought addresses the individual directly. It cannot be outsourced to science, theology, or logic. One cannot hide behind expertise. This refusal also blocks moralization. If recurrence were proven, affirmation could be demanded, acceptance could be enforced. The idea would become another authority standing above life, exactly what Nietzsche has spent his career dismantling. Nietzsche wants the question to remain unresolved because its power lies in its pressure, not its conclusion. Eternal recurrence works only so long as it remains a possibility that cannot be dismissed and cannot be confirmed. It forces a response without settling the matter. This is why Nietzsche presents the idea poetically, provocatively, and fragmentarily. He introduces it as a whisper, a challenge, a burden, never as a system. He wants it to haunt, not to convince. By never proving eternal recurrence, Nietzsche preserves its function as the most severe test of life affirmation imaginable. It does not tell you what the universe is like. It tells you something about how you stand in relation to your life. With this, the arc of eternal recurrence closes. There is nothing more to add, no resolution to supply. The idea leaves the reader where Nietzsche wants them, alone with their life, without consolation, without escape, and without appeal. What follows in Nietzsche's philosophy is not another test, but a deepening of affirmation itself.